I need to tell you something about the Beartooth Mountains of southern Montana before I tell you about the morning of September 22nd, 2019, because the something I need to tell you is the reason what happened that morning is not simply an extraordinary personal experience, but something that restructured my understanding of every wilderness area I have ever worked in. What most people don't understand about these mountains is that they are not empty, in the sense the maps suggest, not biologically empty. Everyone knows the Beartooths are rich with wildlife, empty in the sense of human presence, which is what we mean when we say a place is wild, free of human complication, free of human history and human consequence. The Beartooths above timberline, in the high country above 10,000 feet, where the growing season is 6 weeks and the weather systems move through with a speed and violence that makes planning an exercise in optimism. That country is as close to empty in the human sense as anything in the lower 48. I know this because I have been working in it for 14 years as a wildlife researcher specializing in ungulate population dynamics for the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I thought I knew what was in those mountains. I thought I had, across 14 years of systematic survey work at every elevation and in every season, developed a comprehensive picture of the living world above timberline. I was wrong in a way that is still, 4 years later, impossible for me to fully absorb. I found the footprints on the morning of September 22nd, 2019, at an elevation of approximately 11,400 feet on the northwest face of a ridge I will not name because naming it is not mine to do. I was alone, conducting a late-season pronghorn survey that had taken me higher than my protocol normally requires. The snow was thin but present, the first light snow of the season, which had fallen the night before and which had preserved in the fine-grained crystalline surface of the early morning freeze a trail of prints that ran northwest along the ridge face for as far as I could see. 16 inches long, 5-toed, bipedal stride of approximately 52 inches, consistent across every impression in the trail. Depth in the frozen surface suggesting a source weight that my field experience could only describe as substantial. I stood at the first print I found for what I estimate was 5 minutes, simply looking at it. I have a measuring tape in my kit. I used it. I have a field camera. I used it. I have a GPS unit. I marked the coordinates. I did everything that 14 years of professional field work had built into me as reflex. And then I followed the trail. My solitary journey revealed something profound that I would not understand until the day reached its end. That I had been following those tracks for much longer than the hours of that September morning. That the trail I was on was not the trail of something moving through a landscape. It was an invitation extended to a specific person in the full knowledge of who that person was. The trail ran northwest and slightly downslope for the first half mile, then turned sharply into a drainage that I knew from survey work as an infrequently visited series of small alpine lakes. I followed it at a pace that my survey training produces automatically, not rushing, not slow, moving at the speed of accurate observation, which is the only speed that produces reliable data. The physical characteristics of the trail were consistent and extraordinary. Consistent. The stride length did not vary significantly over the first mile, suggesting a being moving with purposeful efficiency rather than the variable cadence of an animal fleeing, hunting, or navigating difficult terrain by reaction. Extraordinary. At 2 points in the first mile, the trail crossed sections of exposed granite where no impression should have been possible, and in both cases, the prints continued. Faint, barely there, but continuous. Something of this mass had crossed bare rock and left enough of a trace for me to follow. I have tracked ungulates across granite. I know what is and is not possible to read on that surface. What I was following pushed the boundary of possible significantly further than my prior experience had established. The air at this elevation was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that sharpens the senses rather than dulling them. The September light was the specific flat white of high-altitude morning, everything equally lit, no shadows to obscure the detail I was trying to read. I was glad of the light and glad of the cold and glad that the snow was still frozen hard enough to hold the prints with the precision of a cast rather than the smearing of afternoon melt. At the 2-mile mark, the trail entered the drainage's upper section and the landscape changed. The alpine heath gave way to a zone of old-growth forest at the drainage's sheltered lower edge. Engelmann spruce, some of them old enough that their trunks were 5 feet across, creating a closed canopy environment that was, at this elevation in the Beartooths, genuinely unusual. The drainage was a refugium, a pocket of favorable microclimate in otherwise harsh high country, protected from the prevailing weather by the ridge configuration, with a water source and sufficient shelter to sustain forest growth that the surrounding terrain couldn't support. I had been in this drainage before, twice, in 14 years. I had always found it quiet, sheltered, pleasant in the specific way of remote places that feel kept rather than simply undisturbed. I had noted it in my field journals as a location of unusual ecological character and had never returned to study it formally because it fell outside my research protocols. Standing at the forest edge now, with the trail running directly into the trees, I understood something that I had not previously had the conceptual framework for. The drainage was not simply an ecological refugium, it was managed. Not in any human sense, but the specific composition of what I was looking at, the specific distribution of tree species and understory vegetation, and the precise configuration of the clearing at the forest edge had an ordered quality to it that exceeded what random ecological process typically produces. It looked, when I knew how to look at it, like a place that was being taken care of. I went in, slowly, at the specific pace of someone who understands that the environment they are entering has already been aware of their presence for longer than they realized, and who wants to communicate with their pace and their posture that they understand this and are responding to it with respect rather than urgency. I have entered the territories of grizzly bears and mountain lions in my field work, and I have entered them with a full understanding that I was moving into a space where the ordinary hierarchy of my professional life did not apply, where I was not the most significant organism present, where the operating rules were not mine to set. This drainage felt like that. More than that, actually. It felt like a space with rules I had not been given and was going to have to infer from evidence, which, as a field researcher, is a situation I am trained for. I infer from evidence for a living. What I needed, going in, was evidence, and the drainage was going to provide it. The canopy closed overhead, and the temperature dropped 4 or 5 degrees, and the sound changed. Not silent. The drainage had a small stream, and the stream made the specific, soft, continuous sound of water over rounded stones at low flow, and there were birds in the spruce, but the quality of the sound was different from the open ridge, intimate, enclosed, the acoustics of a sheltered space rather than an exposed one. The footprints continued into the forest on the organic duff, which preserved them less precisely than the frozen snow, but sufficiently to maintain the trail's direction, northwest and then curving east, following the stream's course deeper into the drainage, and then something else. At the base of a spruce tree approximately 40 meters into the forest, I found the first evidence that the trail I was following was not the only trail that had been made here. Older signs, partially obscured by recent weather and the accumulation of forest litter, depressions in the duff at the base of the tree that matched, in size and proportion, the impressions I had been following, but that were clearly not from the previous night's passage. These were old, season-old at minimum, possibly more, the edges rounded by weather into the specific blurred margin look of impressions that have survived multiple rain events and temperature cycles. This place had been used regularly by the same being or by beings of the same species across multiple seasons. My field training has a specific response to the discovery of evidence of regular site use by an unknown subject. Systematic documentation before any other action. I spent 40 minutes at that spruce tree, photographing, measuring, noting. I found, in the expanded survey of the tree's immediate radius, 3 additional features I want to describe precisely because they have remained with me as the clearest evidence that what I was dealing with was not simply a large unknown animal passing through remote country. The first was a marking on the tree's bark, not a bear rub, not a claw sign, nothing in my extensive experience with Montana wildlife that I could classify. A deliberate application of something, a mineral pigment I would learn from my photographs when I had them analyzed later, in a repeated pattern across approximately 18 inches of bark at roughly my own shoulder height. Repeated elements, consistent spacing, applied with something finer than a hand, but broader than a claw. The second was a cache beneath the tree's root spread. Several smooth stones, water-worn to the specific roundness of extended river use in a material and a degree of wear inconsistent with the local geology. Someone had brought these stones from a river environment, possibly miles away, and placed them here. The placement was not random, a specific configuration loosely concentric that I could not decode, but that clearly had a logic to it. The third was the most difficult to describe without sounding like I am claiming more than I observed. In the duff surrounding the cache, arranged in what I can only call a radial pattern, were plant materials, dried, preserved, recognizable as species native to the lower elevations of the drainage and to the surrounding ridge country. Dried berries, seed heads, small bark sections, arranged in a way that suggested categorization, like items together, differentiated items apart, with a systematic intentionality that went beyond anything I could attribute to wind scatter or animal caching behavior. I photographed everything, I touched nothing, and I sat for a moment at the base of that tree, in that sheltered drainage in the Beartooth Mountains, and I revised my understanding of what I was tracking. Let me be specific about what I mean by revised, because the word does not capture the experience adequately. It implies a gradual, incremental update to an existing framework. What happened at the base of that spruce was more like a structural shift, the experience of an assumption so fundamental that I hadn't recognized it as an assumption until the evidence in front of me made it visible. The assumption was this, that the high country of the Beartooths, above timberline and away from established trails, was terrain in which the only evidence of intelligent activity would be the evidence of human intelligent activity. My own tracks, other researchers' tracks, occasional recreation users. That framework was so foundational to my field practice that I had never articulated it explicitly, even to myself, because frameworks that are foundational don't present themselves for examination. They simply organize everything else. The cache at the root spread, the markings on the bark, the deliberate arrangement of plant materials. None of these were explicable within the framework. They were not human. They were not the activity of any known wildlife species. They were the output of intelligence operating in terrain I had been categorizing as unintelligent for 14 years, and the recognition of that fact required me to set down the framework that had organized my fieldwork and pick up a different one that had room in it for what I was looking at. I sat in the duff of that drainage for perhaps 15 minutes, which is an unusually long time for a field researcher on a specific survey protocol. I was doing the internal work of reconstruction, not of the specific observations which were clear, but of the interpretive apparatus I would need to make sense of them going forward. When I stood up and continued following the trail, I was a different kind of researcher than I had been when I sat down. The trail continued east from the spruce, following the stream's bend, and I followed it with a quality of attention that had shifted from the systematic attention of a tracker to something closer to the full-body vigilance of a person who has understood that the situation they are in is not the situation they thought they were in. Here's why this changed everything for me. Not the encounter that I am building toward, not the moment of direct contact, but this, the moment at the spruce tree when I understood that what I was following knew that I was following it. The trail was too clean. The prints were too clear. At 11,000 feet on a rocky Beartooth ridge, in conditions that should have produced the ambiguous partial impressions that make tracking genuinely difficult, I had been given, and I am going to use that word with its full intentional weight, a trail that a competent tracker could follow, not a trail left by a being moving with indifference to being tracked. A trail calibrated to be followed by someone with tracking skills. I stopped and stood with this for a minute. The stream moved beside me. A Clark's nutcracker called from somewhere in the spruce canopy. And I thought about the question I had not yet asked myself. Not where does this trail lead, but why am I being shown where this trail leads? I continued because the question did not have an answer I could access from where I was, and because continuing was the only way to develop the information needed to answer it. The drainage deepened as I moved east, the spruce growing denser and the stream widening to collect water from several small tributaries feeding down from the surrounding ridges. This was old country in the geological sense. The drainage had been here through multiple ice ages. The bedrock exposures I was crossing were Archean basement rock, some of the oldest exposed material on the continent. You could feel the age of the place in the way that some places communicate their age through something other than visible signs, a quality of duration embedded in the physical space itself. The trail ended or appeared to end, at a natural bench formation above the stream's left bank. The bench was perhaps 15 meters wide and 10 deep, backed by a rock face and sheltered from above by the overhanging canopy of a particularly large Engelmann spruce cluster. The impressions in the duff at the bench's surface were numerous, overlapping, of various ages, the compressed accumulation of many passages over many visits, like the worn flagstone of a regularly used path. This was the site. Whatever was at the end of this trail, this bench was where it spent time. I sat down at the bench's edge, facing the rock face, in the deliberate, open, non-threatening posture that every piece of field training I had accumulated told me was appropriate for an unknown situation in wildlife work. Make yourself visible. Make yourself still. Communicate your presence openly rather than concealing it. And wait. I waited. I waited for 47 minutes. I know this because I checked my watch when I sat down, and I checked it when it emerged from the tree line to my left, and 47 minutes had passed. And I have thought many times about those 47 minutes and what was happening during them, and I believe, with a confidence I am willing to defend against skepticism, that what was happening was that I was being observed and assessed from cover, while I sat on the bench being as non-threatening as I know how to be. It came out of the tree line at approximately 2 o'clock from my seated position, moving in the open with a deliberateness that was immediately distinct from any animal emergence from cover I have witnessed in 14 years of fieldwork. Animals emerge from cover with purpose. They have a destination, a resource they are moving toward, and the emergence is in service of that purpose. What I watched emerge from the tree line to my left was a being that was emerging in order to be seen. It was making a choice to be visible. The movement was slow, angled to ensure I would register it, and it stopped at the tree line's edge and stood fully in the open, looking at me. I am going to describe what I saw as precisely as I can, and I am going to avoid the register of awe and wonder for as long as possible, because precision serves this account better than awe. Height, between 8 and 9 feet, estimated against the tree line reference, the specific spruce behind it, with a known average height for this drainage that I could use as scale. Body mass, substantial, significantly more than any known primate and considerably more than a black or grizzly bear. The specific density of something built for cold conditions and sustained physical work. Hair, dark reddish brown, the specific color of old conifer bark, with a texture visible even from 30 meters that was longer and less uniform than animal fur. Something closer to hair in its individual strand character. Face, forward-set eyes, significant supraorbital brow, jaw and cranium proportions that were not human and were not ape, and were something between and beyond both. The face was turned toward me. The eyes were on mine. Its eyes, ancient and watchful, held an understanding of the wild and of me. I wrote this in my field journal that evening, and I stand by the claim not as sentimentality, but as accurate observation. What I saw in those eyes was specific recognition, not the generic recognition of a predator assessing a potential threat. The specific recognition of a being that knew who I was in some meaningful sense, that had information about me that informed the quality of its attention. It stood at the tree line for approximately 3 minutes. I did not move. My heart was doing what hearts do in situations for which no amount of professional preparation is fully adequate. But I controlled my breathing, and I controlled my posture, and I let the situation be what it was. Then it sat down at the tree line's edge in a posture that was immediately recognizable and immediately startling. Cross-legged, back relatively straight, looking at me with what I can only call patient attention. The posture of someone who has time and intends to use it. We spent approximately an hour at that bench in the Beartooth drainage. I sat at one end of the bench. It sat at the tree line's edge, 15 to 20 meters away. We looked at each other with the sustained, mutual, fully conscious attention of two beings who have been waiting for this and are now in it and are not sure yet what it is going to be. I have sat with many wild animals in my field career. I want to be precise about what was different in this situation, because the difference is the whole point. With wild animals, even highly intelligent wild animals, the period of mutual regard has a specific quality. You are each processing the other as a category, as a species, as a type that carries known or unknown risk. The regard is biological and functional. It is what kind of thing is this and what does it mean for me? What I experienced in that drainage was different in a quality I can point to but struggle to name. The regard was personal. This being was not looking at me the way it looks at humans as a category. It was looking at me the way one specific individual looks at another specific individual. With information about who I was, with some prior knowledge of me, with an attentiveness that was specific to my particular presence rather than generic to my species membership. I felt known, not recognized as human, but recognized as this human, this particular person, you. My observations during that breathtaking encounter consistently showed a being that was engaged in communication, not in the direct verbal sense that some accounts claim, but in the genuine communicative sense of a being that is expressing something with its behavior and attending carefully to the response. It made several movements during that hour that were not random and were not incidental. It pointed, and I use this word deliberately, twice toward the rock face behind the bench in the specific directed gesture of joint attention. It pointed once toward the stream. Each point was held for several seconds and accompanied by a quality of gaze shift between the indicated location and my face. The classic, unmistakable structure of joint attention, the communicative behavior that says, "Look there," and confirm to me that you're looking there. I looked where it pointed, the rock face. I could see in the morning light, now angled into the drainage, markings similar to those I had found on the spruce tree. Old marks, weather-worn, the same repeated pattern elements. The stream. Where the stream emerged from the spruce cover, I could see, when I looked carefully, a section of bank where the vegetation was organized. Not randomly distributed as vegetation typically is, but in a way that had the same ordered quality I had noticed in the drainage's general composition. Managed. This creature holds a secret that I began, in that hour on the bench, to partially decode. The markings and the managed vegetation and the cache at the spruce tree and the organization of the drainage were not separate incidental features. They were part of the same system, a maintained, deliberately organized, purposeful system for, and this is what the combination of evidence led me to, for monitoring and for managing the drainage's ecology. Active, ongoing, generational management of a specific piece of terrain conducted with knowledge and intention across a time frame that the weathering evidence suggested exceeded my ability to determine a lower bound. I was not in an empty drainage. I was in someone's garden. There is one more thing I want to describe from that hour that I have saved because it is the hardest to describe without sounding like I am claiming more than I actually experienced. In the last 20 minutes of the hour, as the encounter began to have the quality of drawing toward its conclusion, I cannot tell you exactly how I knew this, only that the being's posture shifted in a way that communicated a wind down rather than an interruption. It made a sound, a single, sustained, low sound that was not directed at me and was not a warning call and was not any vocalization I could categorize from the wildlife literature I had spent 14 years accumulating. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds. And then, from somewhere in the spruce stand behind the rock face, somewhere I had not identified as a potential occupied location, a response came. Briefer, higher, a different voice. There was a second being in that drainage, had been through the entire encounter, invisible in the old-growth spruce, listening, monitoring, not the being I had been watching, but another, smaller by the acoustic evidence, and positioned in a way that covered the bench from a different angle than the tree line. I had been surrounded by an awareness I could not fully perceive, monitored from multiple positions, allowed to sit on that bench under the understanding that I would be continuously observed throughout, and the exchange, that single 8-second sound and its briefer response, was, I believe, a conclusion, a summary, one being telling another, "This is done, it went as expected, we can close." What I had witnessed was not a solitary creature encountering a lone human. It was a managed encounter with safety protocols and monitoring positions, and I understood from the acoustic evidence, coordination. Two beings at minimum operating in concert to show one human researcher one thing about the drainage they were tending and to do so safely on their own terms. The sophistication of the operation, when I fully understood what I had been part of, took my breath away more than the encounter itself. This is the chapter I have been building toward, and I want to tell you what I believe the encounter revealed with the same precision I have brought to the physical and behavioral observations, because the two kinds of evidence support each other, and neither is complete without the other. I had been led there. I understood this fully and clearly by the time the being stood, slowly, without haste, in the movement of something concluding a meeting rather than fleeing a situation, and returned to the tree line and was absorbed by it with the soundless efficiency I have now heard described by others who have witnessed this phenomenon. I had been led to that bench, in that drainage, by a trail that was not accidental, but was constructed for the purpose of being followed by a specific person with specific skills. Why me? This is the question I have lived with for 4 years. My best answer, the one the evidence supports when I apply the same analytical framework I use for any field data, is that I had been observed over a significant period across my 14 years of work in the Beartooth High Country, and had been assessed as someone who met whatever criteria these beings use to identify humans they are willing to make contact with. I am a researcher. My work has never resulted in anything that disrupted the high country I survey. I move through terrain with a specific, careful, minimal impact discipline of someone who understands that the purpose of being in wild country is to observe rather than to alter. They had been watching me for years, and they had decided in the autumn of 2019 that the time had come to show me something. What they showed me was the secret that I believe is the most significant thing about these beings, that the general culture has not yet grasped. They are not simply living in the wild, they are managing it. The drainage I spent those hours in was the clearest example I have encountered of what I believe is a continent-wide practice of active, intelligent, generational ecological stewardship. The deliberate maintenance of specific terrain features, water sources, plant communities, and wildlife corridors by beings whose relationship to the landscape is not simply habitual, but intentional and informed. The marks on the trees are records, the caches are supply points. The managed vegetation is not decorative. It reflects a specific ecological knowledge and a specific set of management objectives that, when I examine what I documented in that drainage against what I know about the ecology of the surrounding area, make functional sense. The drainage was being managed to maximize its productivity as a water source, a shelter corridor, and a food production site for the surrounding high country. The management was sophisticated, multi-generational, and effective. I am a wildlife researcher. I have spent 14 years studying the ecology of the Beartooth High Country with the best methodological tools available to my discipline. What I found in that drainage was a management practice whose outcomes exceeded what my own discipline's interventions typically produce, conducted by beings we have not officially acknowledged, using methods we have not studied, in service of ecological objectives we have not been aware of. What we have been calling wilderness, the most remote, most pristine, most wild places we can identify, is not unmanaged. It has been managed continuously and with sophisticated ecological knowledge by beings whose existence we have decided, for our collective comfort, to classify as folklore. And the condition of those places, the specific, often remarkable ecological health of the highest and most remote terrain, is partly, perhaps substantially, a product of that management. This is the secret the tracks led me to, not a being, a civilization of stewards. I left the drainage at approximately 2:30 p.m., moving faster than I had moved going in, not from fear, but from the specific urgency of someone who has information they need to get back to paper before the full weight of it begins to compress and simplify under the pressure of the ordinary world. The descent from the high country took 4 hours. I have made this descent dozens of times, and it is a descent I can make without significant conscious attention to the route, which left my mind free to do what field researchers' minds do at the end of a day of significant data collection: sort, prioritize, identify the implications of what was observed, and begin the process of determining what comes next. What came next was a reckoning with everything I thought I knew about the landscapes I had spent 14 years studying. Not a reckoning with my methodological competence. I had been rigorous, I had been systematic, I had documented what was there to document. A reckoning with the limits of what my methodology was capable of seeing. I had been surveying ungulate populations in a landscape I understood as wild in the sense of unmanaged, and the management dimension of that landscape had been operating at a scale and with a thoroughness that was entirely invisible to my methods because my methods were not looking for it. You cannot detect what you have not decided to look for. The Beartooths are healthier than comparable high country ecosystems across the Rocky Mountain West. I know this not from my own research specifically, but from the accumulated literature of a generation of research in this terrain. The water quality in the Beartooth drainages is consistently higher than modeling would predict. The plant community diversity is greater than succession theory would anticipate. The wildlife populations, including the ungulate populations that are my specific professional focus, show resilience patterns that the habitat quality metrics I measure do not fully explain. They do not fully explain because the metrics do not account for active management by beings whose existence is not acknowledged by the science that produces the metrics. I reached the trailhead at 6:40 p.m. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, watching the last light go off the western ridges before I drove back to the research station. I did not call anyone that night. I wrote in my field journal for 3 hours, the 64 pages that now sit in the same waterproof bag with the photographs from that day. And then I lay on my bunk in the research station and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep, sometime after midnight. I have not submitted any of this to peer review. I have not discussed it with my colleagues at the department. I have not done any of the things that a researcher who has made a significant discovery is supposed to do, and I have been living with the specific low-grade professional guilt of that non-disclosure for 4 years. I am telling it now in this form because I believe the secret is too important to keep in a field journal, and because the alternative to telling it. Watching the high country, I have spent my career studying face increasing pressure from climate change and development and recreation overuse, while the beings who have been managing it for generations are not part of any conservation conversation, is a form of dishonesty I can no longer maintain. The specific drainage I visited on September 22, 2019, is not in any protected designation. It is within the Custer-Gallatin National Forest, which provides some management protections, but it is adjacent to private timber holdings that have been in various stages of sale and subdivision over the past decade, and the access road that serves the trailhead I use has been on a county improvement list that, if implemented, will significantly increase recreational pressure on the terrain above it. The beings who have been managing that drainage do not appear on any stakeholder list for land management decisions affecting it. They do not attend public comment periods. They do not submit letters to the Forest Service or the county commissioners or the various nonprofit organizations that advocate for high country conservation in Montana. They have no official representation in any process that determines the fate of the terrain they have been tending for longer than any of those processes have existed. This is what I am asking people to understand, and it is a harder ask than simply asking them to believe that Bigfoot exists. Believing that Bigfoot exists is a cognitive adjustment. Understanding what their existence means for how we make decisions about wild land is a practical and moral adjustment that goes considerably further. If the condition of the Beartooth High Country is partly attributable to active stewardship by beings we have not acknowledged, then decisions about that terrain that do not account for that stewardship are decisions made with incomplete information about what the terrain actually is and what it requires to remain in the condition it is in. We are making consequential decisions about managed land without knowing it is managed, without knowing who manages it, and without any mechanism for consulting those managers. We are doing this across every high country wilderness system in North America, wherever these beings have been consistently reported and wherever the ecological health of those systems exceeds what the documented natural variables would predict. What most people don't understand about these mountains is not that they contain something unknown. It's that the unknown thing has been taking care of the mountains all along, and that the best mountain places we know are the best because of it, and that what we do to those places affects someone we haven't been willing to see. I went back to the drainage in the summer of 2020, alone as always. The bench was there, the markings on the spruce tree were there. The cache at the root spread was different. The stones were in a new configuration, and the plant materials were fresh, replaced with the current season's harvest. The drainage was tended. It was still being tended. I sat on the bench for 2 hours in the July morning light, watching the forest, breathing the air that moves through old-growth Engelmann spruce in that particular way, carrying the particular smell of something ancient and cold and clean. I did not encounter anything directly, but I did not feel alone, which is its own form of information, its own form of communication. My solitary journey revealed something profound that I want to leave you with, as the thing I believe matters most from everything I have described. The wild places of this continent are not blank pages waiting for human story. They are already written in scripts we have been too arrogant or too incurious to learn to read. The mountains we call pristine are pristine partly because someone has been keeping them that way, patiently, across seasons and generations and centuries, while we were busy deciding that nothing significant enough to account for was there. The tracks I followed on September 22nd, 2019, were left for me. I believe this more confidently with each year that passes. They were an invitation extended by a civilization of mountain stewards to a researcher who had been spending 14 years documenting the outcomes of their work without knowing the work was being done. They wanted me to know. They let me find them. And then they sat with me for an hour in a drainage in the Beartooth High Country and showed me, with the patience of beings who have been waiting for the right moment, what I needed to understand. I have been trying to honor that invitation ever since by telling the truth about what I found at the end of those tracks. The mountains are not empty. They are home to something ancient and careful and intelligent that has been tending them since before we named them. And what we do to those mountains, we do to those beings, and what we do to those beings is the most consequential choice we are currently making without knowing we are making it. Go into the high country carefully. Pay attention to what you find there. Understand that what you are in is not simply nature. You are in someone's home. Behave accordingly.